name is Travis Rector, and I'm a member of Astronomers for Planet Earth. And as part of my talk to you today, I'd like to talk about how we as astronomers and scientists can be advocates for solutions to climate change. Now, the first question that people often ask is, should scientists be advocates at all? We're often seen as being impartial and above it all. And many scientists get uncomfortable with the idea of us maybe marching in the streets the way that Scientist Rebellion does, and that maybe we should just stay in academia dispassionately giving information about climate change, but leave it to other people to find solutions. And first off, I'll emphasize that it's important for you to find what you feel comfortable with. But personally, I feel that it is possible for us as scientists to be advocates without losing that objectivity for which scientists are known. And the key point I like to emphasize is that being objective is not the same as being indifferent. Because of what we know of climate change, from the science of climate change, that's what compels us to act. It would be wrong for us to pretend that we didn't care. Now, Bernadette Rogers is also going to give a talk as part of A4E, and she knows a lot more about ways to get involved in activism. And I have shamelessly stolen this slide from her. And I really like how she breaks it down. And that is that there is a whole range of ways that you can be an activist or just simply being an advocate for climate change. And this can range from simple activities like voting, from talking about climate change with your community and your neighbors and your students, all the way up to nonviolent action and civil disobedience. So I think one of the important things for advocacy and activism is to find the level that you feel comfortable with and works best for you. Another thing that you can do is in your advocacy is to distinguish between your roles as a scientist and as a citizen or a concerned person, maybe a parent. And so you can tell people things like, as a scientist, you know how severe the problem is. And as a parent or a concerned citizen, here is what you feel like you should do. And this is a way perhaps that would distinguish those different roles and maybe make you feel more comfortable with it. Now, the next question is where should you advocate? Well, I recommend advocating where you have the most influence. All of us can and should vote and participate in things as citizens of our societies and our countries, but think about what organizations or what groups that you belong to where you might have the most influence. So for example, professional societies like the American or European Astronomical Societies, and also think about the organizations that you belong to in your communities. Are there church groups or organizations based upon hobbies that you enjoy, where you as a scientist can come in and give people information that will help them to understand the problem and what they can do. When talking with people about climate change and advocacy, it's important to think about what your relationship is with that person. Is this someone you've just met recently? Do you have a long-term relationship with them? Try to understand what their misconceptions might be, and also think about what are the goals that you might hope to achieve. Are you talking with someone who is resistant to talking about climate change, and maybe you can help open their eyes to the concerns you have? Or maybe this is someone who is already very concerned about climate change, and you can help them to get involved. Now, this will vary from country to country, and I'm going to talk about the distribution of attitudes that people in the United States have about climate change. And there have been studies that have been done to just gauge how concerned people are about climate change, from the most concerned, which might be called the alarmed or concerned categories, down to people who are the least concerned, those who are doubtful or even dismissive that climate change is even happening. Now, here in the United States, where we actually have the lowest rates of belief in climate change, over half of Americans are still alarmed or concerned about climate change. So when talking with people about climate change, you'll be surprised to find that the majority of people are along with you. They want to understand more about the problem and what they can do to solve it. Now, which of these categories is it most important to engage? Well, often people feel like we should need to convince the doubtful and dismissive about the problem. But I would argue that the most important group to work with are the people in the alarmed and concerned. So this was part of the Six Americas survey. And one of the things they did is they asked people, how willing are you to get engaged in addressing climate change? And even in the alarmed concerned categories, very few people were actually involved. Only 4% of the people in the alarmed category said that they were already engaged in advocacy for climate change, but 62% of them said that they would like to get involved. So the alarmed and concerned categories, those are the people that we need to help to understand what they can do to be part of the solution. So what solutions should we engage in? Well, again, a lot of this has to do with your comfort level, what interests you, and what groups you work with. So locally, there's a variety of things you can do. The first and most obvious is work with organizations to help them reduce their carbon footprint. So in astronomy, there's many people who are working with their places of employment, their universities, their observatories, to understand what they can do to reduce their carbon emissions. The second, and this is also a very important thing to do, is to divest from fossil fuels. Here in the United States, many of our retirement programs have money that are invested in fossil fuels. And so it's important for us to advocate for our retirement plans to divest from fossil fuel investment and put that money towards the things that we care about. And finally, it's also very important for us to work with our communities and these organizations to develop resiliency for the climate change that's already here and is going to happen. So helping communities to develop resiliency against drought and floods and heat waves and things like that are ways that we can be involved in our local community. Now, when it comes to global solutions, there's a whole range of different things that need to be done. And there's a wonderful resource from a group called Project Drawdown. They have a website called drawdown.org that you can go to and learn about all the different types of solutions that are out there. And this is a resource I love using with students and people who are first learning about climate change because it gives them an opportunity to learn about all the different cool and interesting solutions that are out there. And for the most part, they're solutions we want to adopt anyway because they make our lives better. And so one of the things to emphasize is that there is no single solution for the climate crisis. There's a whole range of solutions and we need to do them all. And in the end, we'll be happy that we did. So Project Drawdown is a wonderful resource to learn about all those different things that are out there. And it'll be a way to help people get enthusiastic about addressing the problem. Now, the problem ultimately stems from our use of fossil fuels. About 90% of climate change is from the use of fossil fuels. That includes coal, petroleum, and natural gas. And so whatever solutions we adopt, this is where the primary focus needs to be. Now, if you had asked me to give this talk 5 years ago, I would have probably talked about how we need to reduce our use of energy. But the good news is that nowadays, there are new renewable sources of energy that are actually cheaper and cleaner than that of fossil fuels. And so, for example, if you look at utility scale solar and wind power, it is out now actually producing electricity more cheaply than fossil fuels. And so one of the exciting things right now is that we can actually transition to these energy sources and we can have the energy we want. We can continue to grow economies while addressing the climate crisis. This plot right here shows how energy has been used in the United States throughout its history, from the forming of our country in 1776 to the present. And I really like sharing this slide with people because it shows how we have transitioned our energy usage over time. How at first our primary source of energy was the burning of wood. And then we transitioned in the 19th century primarily to using coal. And then now we're in the regime of petroleum and natural gas. And if you look closely on the upper right corner here of this plot, you'll see that renewable energies here is a small wedge, but it is growing rapidly. So one of the things I like to emphasize with people is that throughout history, we have always transitioned to new energy sources. And every time we've done it, the new energy source has been cheaper and cleaner than the previous ones. So the good news is this transition is underway, but we need to make this transition even faster. So we need to work in ways to reduce our usage of fossil fuels, but we can do it in ways that we can be excited about. Now, often when it comes to talking about climate solutions, there's often an implicit assumption that we need to make just personal choices. And so when people talk about climate change, they often talk about things that they are doing in their lives to reduce the amount of emissions they produce. So maybe they drive less, they are flying less. And one of the things, these are all important things to do, but what we really need are institutional solutions. We need ways for people to be able to live their lives without using as much energy. Now, the idea of the carbon calculator or carbon footprint actually originated with the fossil fuel industry. So for example, in Knott's, British Petroleum ran a large advertising campaign encouraging people to find what their carbon footprint was. Now, I don't know what the motivation of BP in particular is, but putting it in these terms couches as an individual's responsibility. And often it is very difficult or impossible for people to live lives that don't require a lot of energy. So for example, here in the United States, most cities are built around car usage. It is very hard to get around from place to place without using a vehicle. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to make it possible for people to live their lives without as much usage. So one way to think about it is that people need to make good choices, but they also need good choices to choose from. Now, another major problem, and this is something that we do need to think about when we talk about climate change and advocacy, is there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. Misinformation is information that is wrong, that is accidentally spread, and disinformation is information that is wrong and deliberately designed to deceive. And unfortunately, there's a lot of it. And the reason why is because there is a lot of money on the line. If you look at the breakdown of the most profitable companies in the world, you'll see that many of them are in the energy industry and they produce fossil fuel energy like oil and gas, or they produce electricity from those fossil fuels. And unfortunately, companies have been caught giving money to organizations that spread disinformation about climate change. Now, unfortunately, as a result of this, it can be very confusing for people to understand what solutions are good and which ones are bad. Now, unfortunately, this is something that has happened throughout history and not just in the fossil fuel industry. So the most obvious example is that of smoking. In the 1960s, when smoking was discovered to cause cancer, the tobacco industry retaliated by spreading misinformation and disinformation about the health effects of smoking cigarettes, trying to confuse people into thinking that smoking was actually okay for you. And this right here shows two advertisements that used to run back in the day. The same thing is basically happening right now. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about energy solutions. So for example, wind power is often portrayed as being environmentally just as bad as fossil fuels. So for example, because of the energy required to build them or the waste produced from turbine blades. Now, it is true that every energy source has its problems, and wind energy is no different. However, there is misinformation, deliberate or otherwise, often in these memes. So for example, here where it says that wind could spin until it falls apart and never generate as much energy as is invested in building it, that's just simply not true. And it's important to help people understand that this is not the case so they're not confused. So a common strategy is to try to slow down the adoption of solutions to climate change is what's called climate denialism. And it takes a variety of forms. The most obvious form is just simply pretending that it's not happening at all. Or if it is happening, it's natural and not caused by human activity, or maybe it's not even a problem that we want to worry about. Now, nowadays, perhaps the most common forms of climate denialism are what's called greenwashing, which is when companies and organizations pretend that what they're doing is actually good for the environment, and so you don't need to worry about it. And another pervasive form of denialism now is what's called climate doomism, which is pretending that the problem is so bad, there's nothing we can do about it. Now, all of these forms of climate denialism have one common thread, and that is the goal is to keep people from doing anything at all. That is to just keep doing things as we do now. Now, this climate doomism is pervasive, and one of the things that's very important for us when we talk with organizations about climate change is to create hope about the future and what it can look like. So many people that I talk with, especially young students, are full of despair. Many of them are talking about they don't want to have children because they don't want to bring people into the world that we've created. So it's very important for us to create hope and optimism that we can have a future that we would be excited about. So one of the things that I like to do is to share success stories. So for example, we can talk about past success stories where through the process of science, we've discovered that something we were doing was bad for the environment and we fixed it. So obvious examples are fixing of the ozone hole. When we discovered that chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs were damaging the ozone layer, we banned them and the ozone layer is starting to heal. You can also share local success stories. So I love to talk about how here in Alaska, we have people transitioning to renewable energies to produce electricity more cheaply and more reliably. And that has actually grown local economies. So you can demonstrate how these solutions are a win-win scenario. Another thing you can do that's really fun is there is a online simulator called Inroads, and it's an economic simulator which allows people to play around with what changes we can make, what solutions we can adopt that will allow us to address the issue of climate change. So in the simulator, you can see that it shows how much energy we're producing and by what means, how much greenhouse gas emissions are a result, and how much the temperature will increase. And then at the bottom here are all these controls that you can adjust, which allow you to see the improvements we would get by adopting these solutions. And the cool thing about it is you can show that we can actually by adopting many of these solutions, we can come up with solutions that work. We can reduce our carbon emissions to the point where we can keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius and close to 1.5 by adopting many solutions. And many of these solutions are not radical new developments. They're just simply using technologies we already have. So the good news is by adopting this whole range of solutions, we can actually address the problem of climate change now. So the good news is there's lots of people working on the issue of climate change, and really the best way to get involved is to find one of those organizations that's working towards things that you care about and join them. We achieve more when we work together. And in closing, I'd like to leave you with this quote from former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she said, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." So in talking about climate change, I hope that we as scientists can help people understand that the problem is solvable, and it's actually something that we should be excited about, and we can have a future that we all want to live in. Thank you for listening.